If you walk down the streets of downtown Los Angeles, San Francisco, or New York City today, you cannot look away from crisis. Tents line the sidewalks. Sleeping bags are huddled over subway grates. The reality of extreme poverty and homelessness in America is visceral, loud, and entirely out in the open. It is a daily, heartbreaking reminder of a system that is fundamentally fracturing. But now, imagine stepping off a plane and walking into the heart of Tokyo. The contrast is so sharp, it almost gives you whiplash. You are standing in the most populous metropolitan area on the planet, surrounded by nearly 40 million people. Yet, the sidewalks are absolutely spotless. There is no trash. There are no encampments blocking the storefronts. And perhaps most shockingly for an American observer, there is no one asking for spare change on the corner. It is a vision of absolute, pristine civic order. When you look at the official data provided by the Japanese government, the numbers seem like a utopian miracle. According to their records, the homelessness rate in Japan is a staggering 0.003%. Out of a population of over 120 million people, they claim that only a few thousand individuals are without a home. As an American looking at that statistic, your immediate reaction is a mix of deep envy and frustration. You ask yourself, how did they do it? What secret economic formula did Japan discover that the United States completely missed? How did they manage to build a society that perfectly catches everyone before they fall through the cracks? But what if I told you that the perfect streets of Tokyo are hiding one of the most ruthless, heavily engineered social illusions in the modern world? The truth is, Japan did not solve extreme poverty. They did not find miraculous cure for economic collapse, job loss, or mental illness. Instead, they did something far darker. They built a hyper-efficient, culturally enforced system designed to completely erase the poor from public view. They didn't fix the problem. They simply made it illegal to be seen. Those thousands of people who lost their jobs, their homes, and their savings didn't vanish into thin air, and they certainly didn't all get rescued by government housing programs. They are still there, right in the middle of the bustling, neon-lit city. But they have been pushed into shadows, forced into invisible prisons, and trapped in a system that values visual order and societal shame above human life. By the time we finish exposing how this system actually works, you will stop wondering why American cities don't look like Japan. Instead, you'll be terrified that they might start trying to. Let's peel back the pristine surface of this fake paradise and find out exactly where the invisible people are hiding. To truly understand how a modern, wealthy society can systematically erase its most vulnerable citizens, we have to rewind the clock. We have to look back at an era when Japan was absolutely drowning in money, and the corporate machine made a magnificent promise it never actually intended to keep. After the devastation of World War II, Japan engineered one of the most astonishing financial recoveries in human history. It was globally celebrated as a Japanese economic miracle. During this era of explosive, unprecedented growth, a very specific and highly demanding social contract was forged. It birthed the legendary culture of the salaryman. The deal was incredibly simple, and to any American who remembers the mid-century promise of corporate loyalty, it sounds heartbreakingly familiar. The agreement was this: you give the mega-corporation your absolute, unquestioning loyalty. You work grueling, 80-hour weeks. You sacrifice your weekends, your vacations, your family milestones, and your very identity to the company. In exchange, the corporation essentially becomes your family. They guarantee you lifetime employment. They subsidize your housing, dictate your social standing, and promise to take care of you until the day you die. In this hyper-capitalist setup, the Japanese government didn't need to build a robust public safety net because the corporations were the safety net. For decades, it worked flawlessly. By the late 1980s, the Japanese economy was an unstoppable juggernaut. Stock prices and real estate values skyrocketed to absurd astronomical heights. It was a golden era of easy money, and everyone genuinely believed the music would never stop playing. But then, the music stopped, and the bubble violently burst. At the dawn of the 1990s, the Japanese economy completely crashed, ushering in a brutal, paralyzing era known as the Lost Decade, as trillions of dollars in wealth simply evaporated into thin air. The megacorporations panicked, and faced with plummeting profit margins and angry shareholders, they did exactly what giant corporations always do. They mercilessly shredded the social contract. The ironclad promise of lifetime employment was thrown out the window. Companies began aggressively downsizing, and the first people pushed out the door were the older, more expensive workers. Men in their 50s, men who had surrendered their absolute physical and mental prime to these companies, were suddenly handed termination notices and told they were completely disposable. These were not the people that society typically associates with chronic homelessness. They were not individuals struggling with severe substance abuse or untreated mental illness. These were former executives, mid-level managers, and deeply dedicated white-collar professionals. Their entire existence had been tied to a corporate system that simply ran the math and decided they were no longer profitable. Virtually overnight, these middle-class men were stripped of their incomes, their subsidized housing, and their dignity. With a government that had outsourced its welfare responsibilities to the corporate sector, they had absolutely nowhere to go. Almost immediately, a shocking new phenomenon began to alter the pristine landscape of Japan's immaculate cities. Villages of neat blue tarps and makeshift tents began to sprout up in the lush public parks and along the quiet riverbeds. The victims of corporate greed were suddenly visible for everyone to see. And the Japanese government's response to this visual crisis is where the true horror story actually begins. As the blue tent villages multiplied across Tokyo's pristine parks and quiet riverbeds, a collective sense of unease washed over the nation. For a society profoundly obsessed with cleanliness, order, and public image, this was an absolute visual nightmare. The public was suddenly forced to look directly at the broken, discarded human collateral of their own economic collapse, and it made them deeply uncomfortable. So, faced with a massive, undeniable humanitarian crisis, what did the government do? Did they launch an aggressive campaign to build affordable public housing? Did they hold the megacorporations accountable for abandoning their workforce? Did they weave a new, robust social safety net to catch these falling citizens? No, they did exactly what desperate politicians do when a problem becomes too embarrassing to acknowledge. They simply rewrote the dictionary. Instead of spending billions of dollars to house the poor, the Japanese government decided it was vastly cheaper to just redefine what poverty looked like on paper. In 2002, they passed a highly calculated piece of legislation that strictly and narrowly redefined the legal criteria for homelessness. Under this new federal mandate, You are only officially counted in the national statistics if you were physically caught sleeping outdoors in a highly visible public space, like a city park, a river embankment, or a train station. Think about the sinister, bureaucratic brilliance of that sleight of hand. If you lost your apartment, your career, and your life savings, but you managed to find a temporary cot in a highly restrictive, prison-like government shelter, you were erased from the statistics. If you spend your nights sleeping on the padded floor of a 24-hour internet cafe, or huddled in the corner of an abandoned building just to keep the freezing rain off your face, you officially disappeared from the federal spreadsheet. According to the government's highly manipulated data, you were technically housed. You were no longer a problem they had to solve. This aggressive data manipulation is exactly what allowed the government to broadcast that miraculously low 0.003% homelessness rate to the rest of the world. It was a statistical masterpiece built entirely on the erasure of human suffering. And when major international events approached, like the global spectacle of the Olympics, the pressure to maintain this pristine illusion went into absolute overdrive. The ultimate nightmare for the ruling class was for international journalists and wealthy tourists to see the desperate victims of the lost decade camping anywhere near the stadiums. So, authorities were deployed to aggressively clear out the remaining blue tents. They swept to the public parks, dismantled the encampments, and erected massive chain-link fences along the riverbeds to physically lock people out of their only remaining sanctuaries. They didn't cure the disease. They merely hid the symptoms. The thousands of discarded citizens didn't magically get their jobs or their homes back. They were just forcefully evicted from the public eye, pushed deeper into the suffocating shadows of the neon-lit commercial districts, and completely abandoned by the system. But the government didn't stop at just rewriting the law and tearing down the tents. To ensure these invisible people never, ever returned to the public squares, city planners quietly rolled out a brutal, physical campaign of architectural warfare. The government didn't just stop at manipulating the data and tearing down the blue tarp villages. To guarantee that the victims of the economic crash never returned to the public eye, city planners quietly rolled out a brutal, physical campaign of architectural warfare. Welcome to the chilling, silent cruelty of hostile architecture. At first glance, you might not even notice it. It is disguised as modern urban design, seamlessly blended into the pristine aesthetics of the city. But once you know what to look for, you realize that the entire public environment has been actively weaponized against the human body. Look closely at a standard park bench in Tokyo. It isn't just a flat wooden surface meant for resting. It has thick, heavy metal armrests permanently bolted right down the middle. This isn't a stylistic choice. It is a calculated physical barrier designed specifically to prevent a tired, desperate human being from lying down to sleep. Look beneath the highway overpasses and the concrete bridges, the only natural shelters available when the freezing rain starts to pour. The flat, dry ground has been deliberately paved over with jagged, uneven rocks, or completely covered in rows of sharp metallic spikes. The hidden alcoves and warm exhaust vents outside of commercial buildings have been aggressively fenced off with heavy iron grates. I want you to pause and think about the profound moral decay of that strategy. We use metal spikes to keep pigeons off of windowsills. We use wire mesh to keep rats out of alleyways. In the pursuit of a flawless public image, a highly advanced society took the exact same design principles used for pest control and deployed them against its own vulnerable citizens. They spent millions of dollars in civic budgets not to shelter the discarded workers of the lost decade, but to intentionally inflict physical pain on them if they dared to try and rest in a public space. If you walk through major American cities today, you will start to notice these exact same subtle, cruel designs creeping into your own subways and parks. It is the architectural equivalent of sweeping dirt under a rug, except the dirt is made of breathing, freezing human beings. For the thousands of men and women who had already lost their jobs, their savings, and their families, this was the final eviction. The hostile architecture sent a loud, undeniable message. You are not welcome in the light. You are an eyesore to our economic miracle. With the parks aggressively modified, the riverbeds fenced off, and the public benches weaponized, these people had absolutely nowhere left to go on the surface. But human beings do not just evaporate into thin air. If they couldn't survive on the streets, where did they go? They didn't disappear. They were simply funneled away from the pristine tourist districts and driven deep into the shadows. They were forced into a series of invisible, claustrophobic prisons hidden right in the middle of the neon-lit city. Space is so small and so dark that the rest of the world could finally pretend they didn't exist at all. When you systematically banish the poor from the public square, the most vulnerable among them, the elderly, the mentally ill, and the deeply traumatized, have to be put somewhere. In the United States, you see these individuals struggling openly on the sidewalks of major cities, tragically failed by a broken healthcare system. You walk past them on your morning commute, but in Japan, you don't see them at all. Why? Because the system doesn't just push them into the shadows. It locks them behind the thick, sterile walls of an institutionalized practice known as social hospitalization. To understand the sheer scale of this invisible prison, you have to look at a deeply unsettling statistic. Japan has the highest number of psychiatric hospital beds per capita in the entire world, roughly 4 times the global average. This staggering number does not exist because the Japanese population is inherently more prone to mental illness. It exists because the psychiatric bed has been quietly weaponized as a permanent storage unit for the socially inconvenient. If an individual falls through the economic cracks, develops mental health struggles from the profound trauma of extreme poverty, or simply becomes too difficult, too poor, or too embarrassing for a family to care for, the solution is chillingly simple. They are institutionalized. And we are not talking about a temporary stay to get them back on their feet. We are talking about people who are committed for decades, sometimes for the rest of their natural lives. It is the ultimate sanitary sweeping away of human beings. The clinical white walls of these psychiatric facilities act as an impenetrable barrier between a flawless, orderly society on the outside and the messy, uncomfortable reality of human frailty on the inside. Once these individuals pass through those hospital doors, they are heavily medicated, stripped of their personal agency, and effectively buried alive in the medical system. They become ghosts, conveniently removed from the unemployment statistics and erased from the homeless census. As an American, you might look at the tragic mental health crisis playing out on the streets of Los Angeles or New York and feel a profound sense of helplessness. But when you look at how Japan handles the exact same crisis, you're forced to ask yourself a deeply uncomfortable moral question. Is their alternative actually better? Is it truly more humane to forcibly lock the broken, the poor, and the vulnerable behind the closed doors of a psychiatric ward, out of sight and out of mind, simply so the rest of society doesn't have to feel uncomfortable on their way to work? But social hospitalization only accounts for the sick and the elderly. What about the young? What about the able-bodied men and women who still work 40 to 60 hours a week, yet still cannot afford a roof over their heads? For them, the prison isn't a locked medical ward. It is a 2-by-2-meter cubicle, bathed in the artificial glow of a computer screen. If the locked wards of psychiatric hospitals are the hidden prisons of the sick and the elderly, where do the young and the able-bodied go? What happens to the men and women who wake up every single morning, put on a clean uniform, and work 40 to 60 hours a week, yet still cannot afford a roof over their heads? They don't sleep on park benches, and they certainly don't stand on street corners holding cardboard signs. They simply vanish into the neon-lit, hyper-commercialized districts of the city, swiping a prepaid card to rent a different kind of cell. Welcome to the dystopian reality of the net cafe refugee. These are not the internet cafes you might remember from the early 2000s. These are massive, 24-hour, windowless complexes designed for human storage. For about $15 to $20 a night, a person can rent a private 2-by-2-meter cubicle. Inside, there's a glowing computer monitor, a pair of noise-canceling headphones, and a flat, padded mat just barely long enough to lay down on. There is no door, only a sliding partition or a thin curtain separating you from hundreds of other desperate, exhausted people breathing the same stale, recycled air. The cafes offer free, unlimited soft drinks and coin-operated showers, providing the absolute bare minimum required for biological survival. As an American, you need to look very closely at these people, because they are not who you think they are. They are not unemployed. They are the Japanese equivalent of the American gig economy workforce. They are the people delivering your takeout, stocking the massive warehouse shelves on the night shift, and working the registers at the local convenience store. They own smartphones. They wear clean, pressed clothes. By every outward appearance, they are functioning members of society. They are the working homeless. So why are they living in a fluorescent-lit box? Why can't they just work hard, save their paychecks, and rent a cheap apartment? Because the system has engineered a flawless, inescapable financial trap. It is known as the address trap. In Japan, the barrier to entry for renting an apartment is astronomically high. You don't just pay a simple security deposit. You have to pay exorbitant, non-refundable key money to the landlord, and you are legally required to have a financially stable guarantor, someone to essentially co-sign your existence. But if you've been alienated from your family, or if you simply don't have thousands of dollars in upfront cash, you are immediately disqualified. Here is the brutal catch-22 that breaks people. To get a stable, high-paying corporate job, you must provide a permanent address. But to get a permanent address, you must have a high-paying corporate job. The exact moment you lose your apartment, the trap violently snaps shut. You are forced into the net cafe because it is the only shelter you can afford on a day-to-day basis. But paying that daily rent drains the exact money you need to save for an apartment deposit. You are suspended in a perpetual state of financial purgatory. You are running on a treadmill that requires all of your waking energy just to afford the right to sleep in a 2-meter box so you can wake up and do it all over again. You are not building a life. You are simply renting your daily survival. And as crushing as this economic trap is, it is nothing compared to the psychological prison that keeps these people completely silent. Because in this culture, the system doesn't just take your money and your home. It demands that you take the blame. As suffocating as the physical walls of a 2-meter internet cafe cubicle might be, they are absolutely nothing compared to the invisible, psychological walls that keep these individuals completely silent. To understand why you never see these people protesting on the streets, why they don't demand better wages, and why they don't scream for government assistance, you have to understand the most powerful, unforgiving force in Japanese society. It is a deeply ingrained cultural concept known as sekenii. Loosely translated, it means your appearance in the eyes of the public or your social reputation. But for an American audience, that simple translation doesn't even begin to capture the terrifying gravity of the word. In the United States, we idolize the comeback story. We culturally believe that going bankrupt, losing your home, or hitting rock bottom is just a painful, temporary chapter on the road to eventual success. We blame the economy. We blame the politicians. We fight back. But under the crushing, suffocating weight of sekenii, extreme poverty is never viewed as a byproduct of a broken economy or a ruthless corporate system. It is viewed as a profound, unforgivable personal moral failure. It is treated like a sin. If you lose your job and your home, the culture dictates that it is entirely your fault. You didn't work hard enough. You made bad choices. You are inherently defective. This shame is so visceral and so absolute that the homeless actively police themselves. They meticulously scrub themselves clean in public restrooms, perfectly fold their limited clothing, and hide deep in the shadows, not just because the authorities would chase them away, but because they are terrified of being perceived. They do not want to be a burden. And tragically, many of them genuinely believe they deserve their invisible prison, and the government knows this. In fact, for decades, the system has effectively weaponized this cultural shame to save billions of dollars in public welfare. Japan actually has a federal safety net called the Livelihood Protection System. On paper, it is designed to help the absolute poorest citizens get back on their feet. But there is a devastating built-in catch, a bureaucratic poison pill that acts as the ultimate deterrent. If you walked into a government office, completely destitute, starving, and begging for basic financial aid, the very first thing the social workers would do is pick up the phone. They would enact a mandatory background check, actively tracking down your parents, your siblings, and your extended relatives. The government would formally contact your family and ask them to financially support you before the state would hand over a single dime. For a proud individual drowning in the shame of sekenii, this is a psychological death sentence. The mere threat of having the government call their elderly parents to expose their absolute failure is unbearable. It would bring catastrophic, unforgivable dishonor to their entire family name. So, faced with the choice between receiving life-saving government assistance or protecting their family's public reputation, hundreds of thousands of people make a heartbreaking, desperate decision. They choose to suffer in absolute silence. They choose to starve. They realize that the only way to protect the people they love from the deep stain of their failure is to completely, permanently erase themselves from the narrative. And that agonizing realization leads directly to the most haunting, deeply unsettling phenomenon in the modern world. When the weight of absolute social failure becomes too heavy to carry, and the terror of bringing irreversible shame to your loved ones outweighs your own desire to exist, people do something that defies American comprehension. They don't just move to a different city. They don't just change their phone numbers. They commit social suicide. They become the Jihatsu, the evaporated people. Imagine waking up on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. You make coffee, you put on your suit, you kiss your spouse goodbye, and you walk out the front door, supposedly heading to the office. But you never arrive. You never come home. You leave your smartphone on a park bench. You drain whatever tiny amount of cash is left in your bank account, abandoning your credit cards and your government ID. You walk away from your entire identity, deliberately dissolving into the suffocating anonymity of the Tokyo underbelly. To an American, this sounds like the premise of a gripping true crime thriller. In the United States, when someone vanishes, we organize massive search parties. We plaster their faces on the evening news. We launch federal investigations and demand answers. But in Japan, the evaporation of human beings is a silent, systemic epidemic. It is estimated that nearly 100,000 people vanish without a trace every single year. And the most chilling part? There is an entire shadow economy specifically designed to help them do it. If you have a little bit of cash left, you can hire what is known as a yonage or a night-moving company. Under the cover of darkness, these covert operations will pack up your essential belongings in unmarked vans, strip away your paper trail, and physically relocate you to a hidden corner of the country where nobody knows your name and the debt collectors can never find you. The Japanese legal system inadvertently protects this mass disappearance. Privacy laws are so incredibly strict that unless there is concrete evidence of foul play or violent crime, the police will not actively track down a missing adult. They will not pull security footage. They will not track ATM withdrawals. If you choose to walk away, the state happily lets you vanish because a missing person is one less unemployed statistic they have to account for. And tragically, the families left behind rarely push the authorities to look. Bound by the exact same crippling culture as Sekenii, the crushing fear of public shame, families often actively hide the disappearance. They tell the neighbors that their husband is simply working abroad, or that their son moved away for a private business venture. They swallow the agonizing grief because the truth is simply too humiliating to admit to the world. The Jihatsu are not fleeing because they don't love their families. In their broken, desperate minds, this absolute erasure is the ultimate act of sacrifice. They view themselves as a rotting branch on the family tree, and they choose to violently amputate themselves so the rest of the tree can survive without the stain of their failure. They trade their names, their histories, and their entire futures just to protect a flawless, fabricated illusion of success. For decades, this meticulously engineered illusion worked flawlessly. The neon lights stayed bright, the streets stayed immaculate, and the desperate victims of a broken corporate promise stayed completely invisible. The system of public erasure and private shame successfully hid the human cost of a hyper-capitalist society. But then, an unpredictable global catalyst arrived and violently ripped the curtain down. In the spring of 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic swept across the globe. To stop the spread of the virus, the Japanese government ordered the mandatory closure of non-essential businesses. Almost overnight, the massive 24-hour internet cafes, the hidden claustrophobic prisons holding tens of thousands of the working homeless, went completely dark, with the doors padlocked and their 2-meter cubicles abruptly sealed off. An entire shadow population was violently ejected out into the daylight and onto the spotless streets of Tokyo. The pristine facade instantly cracked. The government panicked, frantically scrambling to rent thousands of empty hotel rooms to temporarily house a sudden, undeniable influx of bodies. But the damage to their carefully crafted narrative was already done. The world finally saw what was hiding behind the flawless civic order. The pandemic exposed the terrifying reality that the state had spent decades trying to conceal. The true poverty rate in Japan isn't 0.003%. That is a fabricated, bureaucratic lie built on hostile architecture and manipulated data. The actual relative poverty rate in Japan hovers around 15%. Let that sink in for a moment. That is statistically higher than the national poverty rate in the United States. Behind the bullet trains and the immaculate public squares, millions of people are walking a razor-thin economic tightrope. Just one missed paycheck or one family tragedy away from total evaporation. And this brings us back to the stark, deeply uncomfortable reality of the American streets. When you walk through downtown Los Angeles, Chicago, or New York, the encampments and the suffering are undeniably agonizing to look at. It is a loud, tragic, and undeniable failure of our own economic system. But after seeing the dark reality of the Japanese alternative, you have to ask yourself a haunting, philosophical question. What is the greater moral failure? Is it worse for a society to leave its broken citizens out on the street, where their suffering is visible and forces the public to reckon with the failure of the system? Or is it fundamentally more evil to build a society so ruthlessly obsessed with its own flawless reflection that it forces its most vulnerable people to literally erase their own existence just so the rest of the country doesn't have to look at them? A clean street is not always a sign of a healthy society. Sometimes it is just a sign of a system that has perfected the art of hiding its victims. Welcome to English 4-Day Channel. Mastering the English language shouldn't just be about memorizing grammar rules. It should be about acquiring vocabulary to decode the profound, often terrifying truths of the world around us. If this story shattered your perception of what a perfect society looks like, don't just passively scroll past. Hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment below and tell me, which system do you genuinely believe is worse? Let's keep pulling back the curtain together. I will see you in the next conversation.